So we're up to part 3, talking strangers and friends at the welcome table, or contemporary Christianities in the American South. I better stay on the mic here. To remind you where we are and how far we've gotten, we started off with hospitality, framing Southern ways of religion in various forms, and how that was illustrated in some responses to Hurricane Katrina. We're going to return to Katrina a bit today. And then we moved into 2 weeks on Rock of Ages, Cleft for Me, Southern Traditions Revisited. Revisited in the sense of these are things that you would think of as being typical of Southern religiosity, Christian themes that most people would think of as being typically Southern culturally. And we're on our second of those. And then for the next couple weeks, we'll go into things that people won't have thought about. So the two today are washed in the blood in the red states, religion and politics, a red state religion, if you will. And the second is Katrina. Faith is only as good as what it does. The activity that was inspired by Hurricane Katrina that is still going on now 14 years, almost 14 years later. So, washed in the blood in the red states. If you were to look at the map of the big political map of congressional districts, and for that matter, mostly Senate holdings on the night or the next morning after the 2016 election, and for the South after the 2018 election, you could be forgiven for thinking that it looked pretty much like the Baptist representation that we saw. That is, the red is the same. Aside from a few districts, and the districts are in overwhelmingly poor black areas, like here in Mississippi, 2nd District, over here in Alabama, over here in Georgia, and not quite coastal South Carolina, and of course some urban districts in Memphis and Davidson County, and so forth. The South, again up to Orlando, is pretty solidly represented by Republicans. And yet, that's how it looks from 3,000 miles away, or 100 miles away in space if they laid it out according to politics. But it's a little more interesting than that, as you all know, reading local newspapers or watching the news. In fact, I argue here in the book, that's not the whole story. Indeed, close up, the distinguishing factor of Southern politics is that everything that is discussed in a political or public forum eventually gets turned into a moral issue. There are no simple technical policy issues, except maybe roads, which everyone is in favor of, unless the contract bidding process is corrupt, in which case it becomes a moral issue. What are state issues that our state legislature and the other dozen Southern state legislatures spend a lot of time on when they're not spending time on roads and education? Abortion, sex education, creation, evolution, textbooks, What's in a textbook? Does the textbook say this was started as a Christian nation or not? Voter suppression, or sometimes it's called redistricting from the other side, or gerrymandering from the left, and photo ID laws and what have you. Racial inferiority, inferior schooling, testing, capital punishment, undocumented persons, LGBT rights, definition of marriage, who can use which bathroom. Some of the solutions get pretty ludicrous, but they're all generated by somebody's sense of morality. And there are three basic camps that inform this sense of how we should decide any given issue. There's the law and order, free market conservative camp folks. They think we ought to have good policing, but free markets, and that people ought to be free to buy wine on Sundays and things like that. That law and order ought to go up to a certain point and then leave us alone. Then there's the civil rights movement heirs. These are mostly, but not exclusively, in the Democratic Party. These are mostly, but not exclusively, African Americans. They're people who believe that the advances of the Southern civil rights movement as a Christian and as a political movement should be secured at the voting booth, in schools, in policing ought to be secured and advanced. They should not be turned back. And there are the people who believe their religion makes them better people, but that politics has no place being discussed in church or from the pulpit. These are the folks who are sort of quietly religious. Religion makes you a better person, but it's bad form to foist it on another person. And there's actually a fourth camp in the law and order camp, I should say, and that is, my religion is good for everybody. And that leads us to Justice Roy Moore and the banner of Christian liberty. Here he is pictured in what for him were better days. You may know that he was twice elected Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. And one of the very first things he does as Chief Justice in the beginning of the 2000s is he gets, I think it's 4,000 pounds, 10 Commandments made by a cemetery company, a cemetery memorial company. And engraved upon it is not only that, but some other civil pious rhetoric. The middle one there says, laws of nature and of nature's God. Where does that come from? Laws of nature and nature's God. Declaration of Independence, exactly. That's Thomas Jefferson, who Moore will use again and again throughout his career as a judge, fairly liberally to prove Christian stuff. So it's in spite of the fact that in Charlottesville, Virginia, there's a Thomas Jefferson Memorial Unitarian Church that they claim him as a deist. 29 miles away think it's more. In Lynchburg, Liberty University has the chancellor's office, a room almost this size, where Jerry Falwell died, and it's been preserved as a memorial. And on his big desk, where he took he had a desk where he died, he had a big table where he took meetings, and there was a huge bust of Jefferson there. And he thought that Jefferson was terrific because he was for separation of church and state, and this is what allowed Baptists to thrive in Virginia and elsewise and elsewhere. So Moore was roundly criticized by members of the bar for bringing this in. Moore points out, well, the U.S. Supreme Court has all this religious and other paraphernalia, Hammurabi the lawgiver, Moses the lawgiver, the Ten Commandments on a murals in the chambers of the Supreme Court. Why can't we acknowledge the source of all law and liberty, God himself? And that plus some of his rulings and his unwillingness to take this out will get him removed from Alabama's Supreme Court the first time by a judicial ethics commission. But it makes him a culture wars hero throughout the country. And he goes traveling around with this in a trailer. I don't have a picture of the trailer, but it can handle 4,000 pounds gross weight. And Christians flock to see it and see him as a kind of warrior for the faith. He will eventually get removed a second time, and the second time's interesting because he refuses to it's not so much refuses, he interposes himself with the execution of a federal court order. The federal court order, that Alabama is in a different appeals court area than we are. And ironically, Alabama got the right to same-sex marriage before Tennessee did, because that's just the circuit court of appeals that they were in that issued it. And he adopted the view and told the court clerks and magistrates that they were not obligated to follow the order because it was an unjust law. And he invoked the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is a Matthew Trewalla, a Detroit-born Catholic, has produced this book that invokes this medieval doctrine devised in the time of religious wars and evil princes and what have you, that said when despots, kings and others tell the courts to do evil things, they don't have to do it. And he's revived this for modern times, saying that federal powers run amok in the case of abortion and other things, need these lesser magistrates to stand in. Now, I look around the room, and some of you are old enough to remember what? Massive noncompliance to desegregation orders, changing the facts on the ground by just not doing, not showing up to school, showing up to another school, founding Christian academies, even trying to divert funds from state funds to these schools. So he's removed a second time. But once again, he's a big hero for it. Every time he gets removed from judicial office, the Alabama bar is so embarrassed, the lawyers, because what this makes Alabama legal system look like. But at the same time, he is elevated as a kind of Robin Hood folk hero for Alabama Christians, along with somebody like David Barron, who keeps telling stories about how all the founders were Christians. You know, Ben Franklin, Christian; Benjamin Rush, Christian; Thomas Jefferson, great Christian, and so on and so on. That sells big in homeschools and what have you. That's one kind of Alabama political story. Let's go on to another, though, which shows you just how interesting this Christian politics stuff is. In the same state, in roughly between the two times that Roy Moore was Chief Justice, Kris Kobach, who you may have heard of, former Kansas Secretary of State, had all these model bills that he'd come up with to suppress illegal immigration through draconian policies. The only state to actually try it, not even his own state, would pass it. But Alabama did pass it as HB, House Bill 56, which made giving material aid or comfort to illegal aliens a felony, among other things. So, if you picked up somebody by the side of the road and gave them a ride into town, felony. If you gave them food at the church pantry, felony. If they were homeless and your homeless shelter is open to everybody, felony. On and on and on. It's a long list of things. Now, two Catholic bishops, and Catholics are important because by this point, a slight majority of Catholics in Alabama are Hispanic. Alabama is not a very Hispanic state because there's not a lot of construction. It's 4 million people, and apart from Birmingham, it's a very slow economy during these years. So it doesn't have the influx that North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, to say nothing of Florida, has when it comes to Hispanics. But they have the panic about it, right? What are we becoming? Two Catholic bishops, the Episcopal bishop, Parsley, and the North Alabama bishop, United Methodist bishop, sue in federal court, alleging the law infringes their members' obligations as Christians, and they win. And this is part of their federal lawsuit. Members of Alabama's churches will perpetrate crimes by knowingly providing food, clothing, shelter, and transportation to those in need without first ensuring compliance. To forbid members of Alabama's faith communities from providing their services is in violation of their sincere religious belief to help others without reservations. Their whole argument is Christians can't be Christians. They can't do any of that Matthew 25 stuff. Shelter the homeless, feed the hungry, visit the people in prison, all that sort of stuff. If you have this law, you've just made being a sincere Christian behaviorally illegal. And they have stuff from the Old Testament, they have stuff from the New Testament, introduced as evidence as why it should happen. They win in federal district court, they win on appeal. They don't win everything, so they don't have standing to bring anything about immigrant children, that is, non-documented children showing up at school. And the law made it the case that principals had to verify the immigration status of every child so that they could call the police on, or sheriffs on the children. A lot of that stuff got put on hold for other reasons. But the bishops won in a lot of the cases. Now, the Catholic bishops didn't get much pushback because white or black or Hispanic, the Catholic community kind of stuck together in Alabama. The Episcopalians, Parsley was retiring, but he was also deeply loved, and he had been a great advocate for all of his episcopacy for church and state issues. So they knew that this was consistent with his behavior. I want you to hear, though, what happened to the United Methodist bishop, Will Willimon. Okay, where are you, Will Willimon? So, unlike, where are we? United Methodist Bishop Willimon was not so lucky. And he and his wife both received calls at night and at home telling them what they thought of his political views on illegals and threatening them and their lives. Some of those callers were happy to add that they were good United Methodists. Although United Methodist bishops are powerful when it comes to making appointments of clergy, they get to hear about almost any and everything from the people in their conferences. Willimon was nevertheless determined not to be the kind of bishop that one of his predecessors had been, one of the 8 recipients of the letter from Birmingham jail, accused in it by Martin Luther King, Jr., of counseling patients with genuine and obstinate evil. Instead, Willimon was inclined to cite the theologian Karl Barth at times when the church had a choice of being popular with the state or being the Church of Jesus Christ. And he was very big, and this is pretty amazing for Karl Barth is a Reformed theologian, not the first go-to for Methodists. Willimon was quite eloquent on the point and decided that after 4 years of being bishop of Alabama, he was ready to go back to Duke and continue teaching. And here was one of the things he said in one of his Episcopal letters to the conference. because he still felt like he had to share his soul with them. The church has to testify in the midst of a sinful world with its message, as with its order, that it is solely Jesus Christ's property, that it lives and wants to live solely from his comfort and his direction. And that's from the Barmen Declaration, when the German Christians not allied with Hitler stood up against Hitler in 1934 at the beginning of the Nazi Reich. Now we'll leave Alabama for our third take of politics in the Christian South to meet this gentleman, William Barbour II, leader of the Moral Mondays and the executor of politics of mass protest. I begin this section in the book saying, many times during my career in theological education, I've heard some version of the question, where are the Martin Luther King Jr.'s of today? The questioners were invariably looking to the civil rights movement as a golden age in the living memory of moral leadership provided by religious leaders. And King is an example of what clergy could do for society beyond narrow parish boundaries. But the question remains problematic because King is, after all, one guy who was supported by a whole cadre of other ministers, supported in turn by a whole set of hundreds of thousands of good Baptist and Methodist and Church of God in Christ people who would show up for mass events. Looking for one Martin Luther King Jr. Is problematic. But I know what they mean. You know, who has that kind of voice to gather together those kinds of people? And I have to say that William Barbour is the only person I have seen in recent years that can come close. So when, and you may not know this, that from 1896 until just a few years ago, when Pat McCrory was elected governor of North Carolina, North Carolina had either had Democrats in office or had divided government. It had not gone fully Republican. Of course, in Tennessee, that didn't happen either until after 2000. And in North Carolina, it happened with a vengeance. And suddenly, a whole bunch of gerrymandering was happening, a whole bunch of attempts to roll back voting rights, roll back environmental protections around pig farming, and school vouchers were being dreamed up at the expense of poor people's education. And he comes to the fore. And what's pretty remarkable about the Moral Mondays movement is not only that they start doing mass protests, but the people showing up to hear this Duke Divinity grad, who's a Disciples of Christ black church minister, give effectively sermons from biblical texts. He always took a biblical text. It wasn't like hearing Al Sharpton talk, who sounds like a minister but is talking politics. In fact, he was talking the marrow of Christian theology. And a friend of mine, recently retired professor Charles Campbell, and another one, Willie Jennings, said that the most remarkable thing was the people who were standing, listening to him and showing up Monday after Monday after Monday to protest the rapid and draconian changes of North Carolina state politics. They were non-Christians, they were Jews, they were ACLU that normally doesn't like to hear a lot of religion in the public. And so Campbell said, why are you here? You've got Jews for Moral Monday. And the woman says to him, I just never thought I would hear Christians stand up for other people here in North Carolina. I'm for what Mr. Barbour's for. And again, they didn't win everything they were out for, but they stopped a lot of the, shall we say, most draconian policies by the force of people showing up and citizens showing up to argue this isn't how things ought to be. Now, and this is just part of what they tended to present as a counter to what, not just a set of demands, but an almost religious political set of hopes. We hold it to be self-evident that all persons are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruits of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. Where does that come from? Yeah, this is Martin Luther King Jr. 101. Take something out of the shared civil commitments of your whole audience. All political power is vested in and derived from the people. All government of right originates from the people and is founded upon their will only and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. Now, you may not know where that comes from, but I'll tell you, it comes from the Constitution of North Carolina. So now they're bringing in local. The people of this state have the inherent sole and exclusive right of regulating the internal government and the police thereof. This is also there, consistently with the Constitution of the United States. Then, a little flip to the religious. The book of Micah asks us, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God? It is in a spirit of openness to the prophet's question that we gather here as people of faith and citizens of North Carolina. That was the first Moral Monday. Then, they always presented ways forward that really most people would agree with, but represented departures from what the political leaders were doing. See if I got one. Education equality by, this is a demand, if you will. Education equality by ensuring every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, as well as access to community colleges, universities, and by securing equitable funding for minority colleges and universities. All the things that had been on the chopping block. Well, in summary, if you ask Southern Christians, the question Cain asked of God, am I my brother's keeper? Southern Christians say, oh yes. They learned that in in Sunday school, right? Where it gets interesting is what that means, right? For some people, to be my brother's keeper means I've got to prevent my brother or sister, in this case, from having an abortion. That's just what that means. For others, to be my brother's keeper means I need to make sure that no matter what kind of family he or she grew up in, they get a really good education. For others, it means I need to make sure that they're not exposed to people who aren't using bathrooms of their birth sex. So the answer is, am I my brother's keeper? Yes. So we're all moral values voters here in the South, by and large. There are very few of those, what used to be called Rockefeller Republicans, people who are just voting their pocketbooks. But we still come up with different answers. Now, welcome to New Orleans. This is the entrance to St. Rochs, as it's pronounced there. French words take on a new valence there. There are actually two St. Rochs cemeteries, part of an old plantation turned into a first free black neighborhood, and then an Italian seafarers neighborhood. Inside that, you can see this mortuary church in the center of the cemetery. You would encounter St. Roch and his dog. Can you see the dog here? Part of his story, look it up later, is his sores are licked constantly by the dog. I don't know why he didn't die of the bacteria, but you know, he's a patron saint of healing. And off to the right, as you're looking at him, are all these kinds of things that you would find at Lourdes. Crutches, plaster casts of legs made whole after rubbing the saint and his dog. Usually, and I wish that was full length because his foot is what's rubbed, and it's kind of rubbed raw. And in the background, we're looking down, let's see, we're looking northward there through all these, as you know, you don't bury underground where the water table is so high in New Orleans, is the church of this neighborhood, which served just generations upon generations of seafood fishermen and their families, mariners. St. Rochs is in the 8th Ward. It's one of the lesser known wards. Everybody knows about the 9th Ward. 8th Ward was hit really hard as well. There's a highway. The highway you saw people on top of, waiting for buses, some of which never came. That divides the 9th from the 8th. I went to southern Mississippi, coastal Mississippi, and New Orleans with a question in mind. Who cleaned up and why? And another question, did the people who needed the help get it? I was at Vanderbilt Divinity School at the time, and on Friday mornings there was a coffee hour, and likewise at my church, the same sort of thing was happening. People were organizing other people to go down and help clean up after Katrina. But I noticed that in spite of the fact that our student body was 25% African American, all the people organizing cleanups were white. And all the places they were mentioning they were going seemed to be white. And I was wondering, well, who's helping out the lower Ninth Ward? I discovered that in fact, to cut to the chase, people just kept coming and crossing the boundaries that had been in place in earlier hurricanes. Camille, for instance, in living memory of some of the older adults, and particularly some of the older African American adults in Mississippi who were pretty astonished that the people who came were not people who looked like them, but but I want to tell you some stories that really underlie what this is as a religious kind of experience for the people who went and the people who received. I'll start with Alice Graham. Dr. Alice Graham was at the time, she was a professor at Hood Seminary in Salisbury, North Carolina. She had been teaching, she's a pastoral care professor, she had been teaching a course about how you handle tragedies in your congregation. Hood enrolls both black and white students, and she just got it in her heart, we should go down and try to help. And only as they're going in the school's van with stuff, U-Haul and back, does it sink in that she had made a vow when she was a 10-year-old that she would never set foot in Mississippi. As a 10-year-old, Emmett Till was killed. And as a boy who supposedly wolf whistled, supposedly, and she said, that's the kind of place I will never go. And as she's traveling, her fear about Mississippi just overwhelmed her. And she said, what am I doing? I'm taking students, black and white students, into a place that will not receive them. And the anxiety builds and builds. And she, the grip of fear was only broken when they get to the coast, and they go into a restaurant, and it's a mixed restaurant, the clientele. And the waitress that meets them at the door sees all these young people and says, what are you all here for? Or no, where are you guys from and what brings you here? Well, one of the students said, we've come to help. We're from North Carolina. And the hostess turned around and announced to everybody gathered that these people have come all the way from North Carolina to help us. And the restaurant broke out in applause. What was significant was that the restaurant had black and white customers in it. And at that moment, it was like, whoa, I'm not back 10 years old again. I'm in the present now. It's not Mississippi of my childhood. Something is different here. So she could be present and open, and as she gets invested, she takes her students back. She finishes the semester. She tells the president of Hood, I've got a sabbatical, I'd like to go spend it there using my skills, helping first responders cope. When the sabbatical ends, she goes back and tells the president, I'm moving there. And pretty soon she's the president of a Mississippi coastal disaster response thing. She's subsequently the president of a UCC ministry that's over 100 years old, that's been responding to hurricane crises and endemic poverty since 1900. But the thing that is actually so amazing is the transformational experiences she begins to have. Another Auslander, if you will, is Daniel Schwartz. He's a PICO organizer. He's Jewish. He says here, I think faith and democracy in many ways are not the same, but there are elements in common. Genesis gives me the idea that we're all in this together. And democracy at its best means we're all in this together. He works with Jewish rabbis and ministers in the Ninth Ward and downtown, Black Baptist mostly. And they're working on mostly incarceration of black males and post incarceration, because the terrible, terrible issue at the heart of poverty in some parts of New Orleans is just how much the black families have been ripped up by the fact that a third of their males are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated and lacking rights and lacking the abilities to get appropriate employment, having committed usually some of the same crimes that young white males have committed, a differential system. He tells the story of being at a event of this organization where a black pastor says, will all the people who have a family member who's in prison raise their hands? And pretty much every family grouping raised their hand. And the rabbi there got up and said, I don't even know anybody who's gone to prison, and became convicted. Daniel Schwartz is there as an in-between person working on how do we combine the resources of the significant Jewish community in New Orleans with the fundamental lacks of these church-related communities in downtown and Ninth Ward and other wards. Then there's Ben McLeish. Ben had worked in a Ninth Ward ministry that went belly up right after the Ninth Ward filled up, and he moved over to the Rock, as they called it, because it drained first, and they began a CDC, Community Development Corporation, that birthed a church, a Presbyterian Church in America, so a conservative Presbyterian church. his quote here is, "We charge them $40 a day per person." This is an answer in part to how do you make sure that your helpers really help. We charge the people that come to help us to rehab homes and turn them over to people who need homes, $20, $40 a day per person. Their costs were $20. $20 goes towards supplies, and $20 goes towards an indigenous leadership fund so that I can hire this guy for a week who's maybe a former felon himself, to be a helper so he can put food on the table for his family and the kind of turn back the hearts of fathers to their children and provide work in the community. So the forms that religious life takes in the context of the crisis were much richer than I ever expected. Eugenia, who I have to use a pseudonym for elaborate reasons, she went fugitive during the fact-checking process, worked in the Ninth Ward. And she says, I asked what gave her hope. She said, it's probably the connection between their faith and their quality of life. That is, the very, very poor people she worked with. You know that a lot of our people have been conditioned that if you live too comfortably, then that's not spiritual. Or if you're thinking too much about the need to have an education or have economic equality, then that's not spiritual. They don't understand that when Jesus speaks of having life and having it abundantly, it's not just about money, it's about all things: your health, your education, your opportunities, your access. Now, some of the things she did were just astonishingly clever. So clever that I'm reminded of Jesus' admonition to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Parents and grandparents sometimes complain that they do not feel equipped to act as advocates for their children and families in school because they themselves did not know how to read. And so Eugenia gets out the large print, easy to read children's Bible and says, "Do you know these are the same words as your children are in your children's books? Wouldn't you like..." And so she further says, "Here are people who've gone to church for 30 years and hid even from their pastors the facts they couldn't read. But a summer program and some culturally competent literature shared between the generations makes a way out of no way, and joyful readers out of everyone." So for Eugenia, there was a connection between her Christian faith and a better life in the here and now. And she meant to share that faith every day. And her ministry was vitally important because before Katrina, there were 9 churches, pastorates in the Ninth Ward. Afterwards, only 2 of them were still in place 10 years later. Some of them just relocated to a different city with population like to Houston. Some of the pastors tried to come back. I think 4 tried to come back and had terrible health problems from the stress. Some died of heart attacks. So these ministries on the ground with people who were in effect condemned to be on the ground, because that's where the project was that they were coming back to, or the house they were coming back to. They needed somebody like that. We'll talk about 2 pastors, one of whom was fortunate, one who had to cope more. Don Frampton led the St. Charles Presbyterian, St. Charles Avenue Presbyterian Church. He said, the exciting part was that we had this work and we knew exactly what to do. We were so focused as a church, we knew why we existed. This is why we're here, to do this for such a time as this. Not everybody came back at once. A lot of their members were flooded out and needed to be rebuilt. There was all that pastoral work to do. But they had a manse next door that they immediately turned over into like a hostel for people who said they wanted to come and help. So as soon as they got out of Houston Memorial Presbyterian Church and back into New Orleans, they were hosting teams for 18 months for gutting and all the way to now for rebuilding new homes, habitat homes from the bottom up. And rather than this be a downer, we're still mucking out houses, we're still building houses, is this what we're about? It grew the church. It grew the church because that's what they were finding their meaning and purpose in. Rod Dixon Rischel is the only United Methodist pastor. You know how United Methodist pastors get moved around? He was, when we visited 10 years later, the only pastor in the United Methodist Seashore District, so the bottom part of the state, who was still in the Seashore District. A lot of the pastors, their homes were destroyed, their churches were destroyed. Some of them eked it out for a while. He was born in the Seashore District and had been through several hurricanes before. And fortunately, he said his wife had a job at the well-built High Ground Hospital, so they had a place to sleep. He was reassigned after he got one church back on its feet to another church down the way about a dozen miles. And this was another church that had felt the impact. And when he was invited in, the parish pastor relations committee says, just one thing, we don't like to use the K word around here. We'd appreciate it if you don't preach that too much. We've had too much. Don't say Katrina. And he said, but you don't need to say much. When you stand up there and you're preaching and you say something like, we understand about loss, and you're looking at someone who is 75 years old and they and their home went back to a slab, nothing. Then they rebuilt and they still live. The community still lives in the same place. They know something about loss. So let's go to the question. All this loss. Was there still God there? Well, Susan Turner, who was at the Biloxi Missionary Baptist Church, said, I can't imagine how I would have taken it if I hadn't been a Christian. I don't know how I would have felt. There may have been some people felt like God had let them down, but I saw renewed faith in most people. James Cox, Susan Turner ran the ran the education program. James Cox ran administered the congregation even as their pastor got Parkinson's. They held the place together in the 10 years afterwards. He said, I didn't think at all about losing my house. I thought about how lucky I was to have the people around me. It's fairly extraordinary how resilient some of these people were because of who they had and how they saw it. And finally, let's go eschatological with Ben McLeish. There are lots of theological angles to the city of New Orleans. For one thing, there's a city that resembles the coming kingdom like no other city in our country. One day we'll be at our banqueting table feasting before the Lord, and hopefully they'll be catering it out of New Orleans. Because we've got some good fun, some good banquet here. We've got an incredible sense of generosity. So those are some Katrina stories. I'll take a few questions. Yeah.
FEMA didn't come up at all in this.
What's that?
FEMA did not come up in your conversations at all, and it got so much criticism for it.
Oh, FEMA?
Yeah.
Yeah, FEMA's in the book, and Rod Dixon Rachel says FEMA and insurance companies can make a pastor go to cussing. Susan Turner says FEMA would not come any closer than 3 miles. So the big Bay Bridge that goes, I think it's Ocean Spring, somebody knows Mississippi better, over to a bridgehead near Biloxi, East Biloxi. You had to come towards Biloxi 3 miles to the church. So lots of older people who need food, who need medicine, who need all this other stuff. She rides her bike, you know, knobby but not too knobby tires. And and the FEMA guys, the government people, will not come any closer because that's where the air conditioning and electricity are. And this woman who's probably 50 at that point is riding her bike, having convinced, as only somebody who's used to being in charge as a school principal, that she'll take the checks, vouchers, get the receipts signed, and bring them back on her bike. So she's going out to the elderly people, getting that work done. And yeah, it's rough. So, the upside is the church and the citizens showed up, but the government, heck of a job, Brownie. Yes?
What was the time frame for the passage of House Bill 56 in Alabama?
House Bill 56. So
Its initial passage?
it was signed into law June 9, 2011. Yeah. And Arizona Arizona passed a similar Kris Kobach one first, but more of its provisions, because you're in a different district and a different circuit, were placed under an injunction and have never been put in place. We're a different climate. Believe it or not, you think of Arizona as more Wild West, and don't always think that. Other questions? Yeah.
I mean, I like your stories. There's more optimism about Christianity here and what folks are doing in places like where Katrina hit. Do you see a difference in attitudes and generationally I mean, is it I mean, some of these laws, I think, are older Christians, conservative Christians that are afraid of the changes. Do you see younger people have a different thought about Christianity and what it means?
Yeah, so, I'll go just from doing history to speculating, but it's in part because I work with younger people all the time, and a lot of our divinity students do not come from like mainline liberal kind of backgrounds. They come from non-denominational, fairly conservative churches, and nevertheless, they're pretty chill with, they're raised in a fairly conservative household and a church, and then they discover they're sitting next to a lesbian, and they're quick to ask, well, how is that? How was it to grow up? And, well, I grew up Foursquare, and then my parents joined this kind of church, and it's like the younger generation is having a very different sort of, they have a different tolerance and acceptance of one another on issues that older generations have been frightful about. It's like Brexit. We're becoming like Brexit. They say that if Brexit were held today, enough of the above 65s that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, and enough of the people under 30s who didn't show up to vote would change the whole result. We're having that experience. But the thing that's interesting about the South is they all still went to church, right? So we're becoming culturally different, but it's not because we're becoming de-Christianized, we're becoming differently Christian. This is even happening at places like Liberty University. So there's a great new book by, I think it's Jonathan Coley, about being gay at a Christian university. It's a sociological study of, it's not that you can say you're gay, but he found a whole bunch of people who had been to like Liberty and Lee and other places and asked what their experience was. And they wanted to be both, and still want to be both. And that's some of what we'll get into later. Yeah.
Do you have any comments about the current political issue of school vouchers and how that relates to Christians, these various movements? You talked about different groups and
Okay.
how they come down on social issues.
Well, let's relate it to fear, right? So parents always want the best for their children, and that's just a factual statement. How do they want the best for their children, and do they have the confidence in the public schools that maybe they once had? We have culturally, and this goes well beyond the South, run down schools and what the government does for so long, especially since Ronald Reagan's administration. And Rush Limbaugh has been calling public schools government schools, with that little extra snideness, that there are people who have bought it. But there are also actual organizations like the American Family Research Council that are telling people, you need to homeschool your children, you need to get them into a charter school, you need to get them into a place. And it's fear-driven rather than solutions-driven. But it's also fear-driven from the standpoint of more bad stuff has been happening at schools since Columbine. But we're only, one mass killing away from killing at a charter school, right? We devise things that we think are going to solve everything, and then discover we've built our own mousetrap for ourselves. And by way of advertising, we're going to get into Christian homeschooling and LGBT in the South, and mega churches and Roman Catholics, changing Roman Catholics in the South in the next 2 weeks. So look forward to seeing you then.